Nick, thank you so much for agreeing to join us for an episode of the Responsible Edge Day. I know you and I met some time ago now, and I've been really looking forward to having you on. I really appreciate you giving up some of your time this Thursday morning.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent stuff. Excellent stuff. Nick, let's kick things off. As you well know, with our format, always really keen to give our listeners a really kind of deep understanding, really, of you and your background. So we've got sort of 20 minutes or so to kind of dig into that. Particularly touching on perhaps the role that ethics, responsibility, and sustainability has played in your decision making and the roles that you've taken on over the course of your career. Feel free to start wherever you like. We get some guests who literally take us back to school days and the influence of certain experiences. Then others start a little later. But yeah, just give us a flavour of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I won't go back as far as school days because it's far too long ago. But I'm a chartered accountant by training, and I think that training instills a certain degree of kind of integrity and ethics and a belief in trying to do the right thing right from the outset, if you like, and that's always been important to me. I left the accounting profession though and started working in banking in the early 90s. I worked for a variety of different banks, primarily in the derivative trading world, in kind of middle office type roles and business management roles, and really enjoyed it and gravitated more towards operations and chief operating officer type roles, and trying to fix processes and focusing on kind of, holistic risk management, if you like. So, thinking about, what could go wrong, what might go wrong, what are the causes of things that could go wrong, and really trying to focus on fixing that. And that really is the kind of the start of, building sustainable businesses, if you like. So businesses that can last and that can perform, is what sustainability is really all about from a corporate point of view. So I worked nearly 30 years in the banking industry, managed small teams, but also managed very large teams. I worked in London, I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in India. So I've seen all sorts of different kind of cultural teams and approaches to things as well. And sustainability from a business approach has always been central to me. And then obviously with the ESG, movement and, sustainable views around the planet, that has become, a big part of my belief system. I care about the planet, I care about the future. And so the kind of sustainability thing becomes a kind of a full circle almost.
Nick, that was beautifully done, beautifully introduced. But and within 2 minutes, you've just managed to condense what I know is a sort of varied and deep career that you've had with lots of interesting things going on. I'm going to actually take you back to first question. I'm going to take you back to the accountant, being an accountant, a chartered accountant, and moving into banking. You mentioned that your experience of becoming a chartered accountant gave you a really solid foundation in kind of ethics and corporate practice and doing things the right way. You then went into the banking sector, which of course, for a lot of people out there that perhaps don't work in the banking sector, there's a lot of question marks over the role that ethics perhaps have played within the industry. Looking at your experience of going from accountancy and into the banking sector, just touch upon or comment on your experience of ethics working within banking over the following 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, starting my career in accountancy, or auditing as it was, did give me a good grounding in ethics. The whole premise of the accounting profession is wrapped up around, true and fair, if you like. And it was a very, auditing and accounting is a very, rules-based approach. Certainly when you're junior and you're looking to get kind of qualified. I left the auditing profession because I was more interested in processes and transforming processes and improving processes. So that was what motivated me really to kind of leave the auditing profession and go and move into banking. And also in the early 90s, and I started in derivative world, banking was exciting. And there were lots of new products. There were lots of really smart people. It goes back to the kind of like the rocket scientists in derivatives. So there are lots of, really smart people to learn from. There was also an awful lot of money being made by some of those institutions, and also an awful lot of money being made by individuals. And that always presents a slightly compromising situation. And actually, my first role in banking, it was such a long time ago, was kind of pre-ING, and I don't know, or Bearings rather, which became kind of ING, the Nick Leeson scandal. And at that time, people doing the weekly or daily profit and loss statements for traders were working for the traders. So this kind of segregation of duties concept, which is much more commonplace these days, wasn't even there back in the early 90s. So that obviously presents, an immediate kind of like conflict and calls into question people's ethics. Personally, hand on heart, I didn't see any particular kind of issues, but certainly the framework was there where, it could be abused. And then I think through the following kind of decades, there's obviously been lots of, questions and scandals around conduct and ethics in the banking industry, almost to the point where, people would perhaps be embarrassed or slightly ashamed to admit to being a banker in a social environment, because people would go, oh, you're greedy, or where are your ethics? And I'd like to think that that's being addressed and is kind of coming back a little bit now. But for sure, there was a period where I think money was driving the opportunity for people to behave badly.
And I'll perhaps come back to follow up on that, but I'd like to also pick up on in your opening salvo, you mentioned sustainability and the role, or the growing role, that sustainability played in your personal beliefs and in your thinking around what you want to do next. Where did that start? Was sustainability and the sustainability of sustainability of finance, etc. Was that always something that was of interest and intrigued you from an early part of your career, or was there a particular point that you became inspired to really focus your energy and attention on it?
So I think, as I touched on, sustainability in a holistic sense, to me was, lasting, right? Sustainable means, it can last. And therefore, working in an area of business with a sustainability hat on used to be about risk management and about, ensuring the longevity of that division or that business line or that product. So I think that's always been core to most people in business, even if they didn't necessarily give it a sustainability kind of like, flag to it. And this may sound a little strange, but working in the Middle East also began to kind of change or influence my thinking around sustainability. Obviously, very fossil fuel focused economies. And I did a fair number of community volunteering kind of like projects in the Middle East that were very focused on communities and education and scarcity of water and real issues that people in the Middle East were beginning to face as a consequence of climate change. And so that really began to kind of make me think about the sustainability of the planet and humankind, if you like, right? So really kind of, big thinking. So from going from sustainability of a product line and managing the risk around that to sustainability of the planet is quite a big shift. But it was partly through living in the Middle East, but also partly through engaging in, CSR type activities and volunteering and really being kind of exposed to local kind of like pressures that really influenced me.
And out of interest, Nick, because I think a lot of our guests refer to kind of the impact of that first-hand, like, lived experience of something that just tweaks them or triggers them to really think about it in terms of that broader, bigger picture. You mentioned CSR initiatives. Did you also grow a sense at that time of the potential impact that corporates could play in addressing some of these issues? Did that sort of, was that born out of, the work that you were doing, that you could see the effect that you could possibly have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the mobilization of people to, within corporate to be, to do charitable kind of donations, or to, to run a marathon, and, the company would, match the kind of like the sponsoring. So, basic things like that, but also, an obligation, or not an obligation, but a lot of companies in the Middle East are aware, I think, of their environment and where they work. And I think that the good companies do great efforts to allow their employees to, lift their heads up and think beyond the company that they work for, and think about the wider community that their company is servicing, if you like, is one thing. But then there's also the power of the corporate itself in terms of the products and how it engages with the community. And in banking, then that comes to, financing, and, financing infrastructure, financing initiatives that will promote trade in an area. That's all part of kind of sustainability. And I think that the linkage between CSR and sustainable financing isn't always obvious to employees, but through CSR, through volunteering, certainly for myself and my colleagues, you began to have a greater appreciation of the role that finance can play, and the role and how important it is that corporates and banks think about the communities that they're serving, and kind of switch that. And I'm not saying that the banks that I work for were particularly guilty of that, but switch that kind of, it's not just about profit. There's a purpose, and there's an element of kind of serving a community, not to compromise profit, but that hopefully those two things can kind of go together. So I think that the CR initiatives that I got involved with made me feel good. They, helped me engage with the community, but they also opened my eyes a little bit to the power that, good, in inverted commas, corporates can have on the wider community.
It's fascinating, Nick. You kind of nailed it there, but I was sort of reflecting on the sort of enhanced awareness that getting on the ground and seeing the impact in real terms, as you say, is not going to just fundamentally necessarily change the dynamics of the organization itself, i.e. what the bank's purpose is, but it allows you to have a much more sort of appreciative perspective, if you like, on the role and impact that your work can have, which is only going to make your decision making, presumably, as a bank, then more effective in terms of being sympathetic to the real world impact that you're having. So it's fascinating that.
And also, sorry to interrupt, I think it's also, it was also really interesting engaging with people through, CSR initiatives to hear what they thought of the institution that I was working for, right? So real, on the ground perception of the bank, right? Did they think that the bank was a good bank, or a greedy bank, or, a badly behaved, bank? Or not, or if they did have a particular view of that institution, then why, and how was it kind of like formed? That's also kind of, really, really interesting, and really a really useful kind of side benefit of, CSR type activities, where you engage with the community and you really hear what they think of you in a kind of informal way.
That's fascinating. To create a feedback loop through the prism of, it's not a customer dynamic. It's a completely different dynamic that fascinating. Nick, I'm jumping around a bit here, but in terms of, I'm just thinking about the sort of the timeline of events. You're working in the Middle East at this point. What happens next? Kind of, did you come back to the UK, and what did you do next?
So before I came back to the UK, I actually had a period of time working in India. So I moved to Bangalore, which was fascinating and was a kind of a complete, if you think moving from London to the Middle East was a kind of a change, then moving from the Middle East to India was a whole another step change. Completely kind of different environment. I was responsible for much larger teams of people there as well, and also a very different kind of lens in terms of sustainability as well, right? So the Middle East, water scarcity, fossil fuel kind of focused kind of like countries is one lens around sustainability. But then India puts a different lens on the whole thing, right? With the population and the difference in living standards, in your face, kind of, all day and every day. So really, kind of, makes you start to think about the S, if you like, in ESG. Unfortunately, it was quite a short stint in India. As COVID began to kind of grapple with the planet, I moved back to London during COVID.
Okay, fascinating. I myself have travelled through India, and I can really empathise with that focus or that acknowledgement of the S of the ESG. It's so stark that sort of the differences at play. Well, it sounds then that you've been in the Middle East and perhaps had more of from a sustainability perspective, an influence on you from an E perspective. You've then headed to India and you've got a bit of S. G seems to me to be kind of a core or component really to the whole career that you've had. So essentially you come back to the UK, COVID's having its merry way with the world, and you're sat there with this full ESG kind of picture, if you like, in your mind. What happens next?
So I come back to London, and very fortunate to be involved in a big restructuring plan at the bank I was working for at the time, and I'd also had a really enjoyable and varied career working in different parts of financial services, different parts of the world, and I look back on this fondly. The restructuring allowed me an opportunity to be restructured myself. So I actually left financial services towards the end of 2020 after nearly 30 years working. And as I say, a really enjoyable career. And you're completely right. I kind of had, good grounding in the G, and then bumped into the kind of like the E and the S along the way. I'd looked as well during that kind of journey at my own health and had kind of, my own sustainability, if you like, and had ups and downs with that. Did lots of exercising when I was in the Middle East. Was a vegan for a period of time as well. Came back to London, got restructured myself out of financial services and took a little bit of time out to kind of reflect and think about what might be next.
And at that point, what did you decide to do?
So I think one of the things that I'd thought about when I was working in financial services was, my learning journey over 30 years. So it had started in a very structured kind of way, doing chartered accountancy exams. And they're very kind of like structured. You have, focused learning, periods, and then you do some work experience, you do more learning, very exam kind of focused, all with the aim of getting a qualification. So that was kind of easy to kind of like follow. And then you go into the corporate world, into financial services, in my case, and then learning kind of shifts, right? And changes again. And there's much more learning on the job. There's much more learning, from doing things, hopefully not making too many mistakes, but making mistakes is part of learning. Water cooler kind of like conversations, And then with the kind of proliferation of digital learning, a lot of kind of like learning or training, perhaps I would kind of call it, kind of given to you. And then if we go back to the kind of the questions around ethics and conduct, learning also then started to shift, particularly in financial services, into the mandatory training space. Mm-hmm. And so, all bank employees or all financial service employees are required to do a certain number of trainings, per year on key topics like financial crime, cybersecurity, etc. And the digitization of learning has made this easy to push onto people, because you get a notification, you've got to do your training by a certain date. If you don't do it, there'll be some form of punishment, and you have to do it. And I guess I felt that unfortunately the balance had kind of shifted again, right? And it wasn't about learning. It was about ticking the box from a regulatory kind of like point of view, if you like. And I understand why. Financial institutions need to be able to tell the regulator that their staff have received training in X, Y, and Z topics. They aren't required to say our people are learning these topics. They are required to say our people have received training. So I was reflecting on that and thinking about, what's happened to learning, and my own kind of journey from a very rigid, process through my accountancy qualification to learning fast and furious on the job with, lots of very smart people in a segment of the industry that was kind of like growing quickly, to then kind of coming to this space where mandatory training was kind of killing the enthusiasm for people to learn. So then I got introduced to my now business partner, who was also, I think, thinking along the same lines, and we launched a company called Attain, which is really looking to really change or revolutionize the approach to learning, particularly in financial services. We started with a focus on sustainable finance.
And we will come on to I'll dig a bit more into Attain as we go through, but just touching upon you beautifully described the sort of your first experience of sort of education and training in accountancy. Then you move into this kind of fast-paced sort of on the job, as you've alluded to, water cooler conversations based learning, which is innovative and it's exciting, and it's you're really adapting and being influenced by lots of different things. And then almost the kind of the tick box mandatory exercises that have taken over, if you like, in the final stages of your career in financial services. In that stage, was this, you were obviously operating in COO related roles. Were you was this seeing this firsthand with the kind of impact that it was having on perhaps junior members of staff, that you look back and thought, this wasn't how I learned when I was at the start of my career in financial services, and you're really missing out on all of these sort of more sort of intangible, sort of inspirational moments of learning and education? Was that part of your reflection as you look back on their sort of stages of growth and development?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I still think so. COVID had an impact on it as well, right? So before COVID, people were still learning with and from each other, and people were, sat next to each other in the office and, trying something and getting stuck and asking their colleague next to them, how did you deal with this? How do we kind of do it? Or, when they were at the water cooler, having a chat. So that kind of learning was still going on. But quite rightly, there are some fundamentally important topics like cybersecurity, like financial crime, and arguably in the future, like sustainable finance, that financial institutions and society recognizes are really important, and that everybody should learn about them. But they're slightly existential for many people, they shouldn't be, but they're kind of, yeah, I'll do my cybersecurity training. I'm not, it's not really about me, but I'll do it because I kind of like have to do it. I'll still do my on-the-job training by speaking to my, colleagues and asking kind of questions. Of course, COVID changed that dramatically, right? Because then all of a sudden you're not sat next to a colleague. You're at home with your computer and maybe you can jump on a Teams call. But if you come up against a problem, then that kind of social aspect to learning really changed, right? And really becomes kind of much more difficult. And I guess, so COVID presented a particular problem, but I think also the mandatory learning and the digitization of that also just prevents a conversation about it, right? So if you are in the office, you could at least, kind of go, have you done your cybersecurity training, or have you done your financial crime training? What did you think of it? How did you answer that kind of like, question? Or tell me the answer to question 9, whatever it is, right? But at least you have the kind of conversation. COVID and everybody being at home changed that. And now we have this kind of hybrid situation. And I think the opportunity to learn with and from each other is reduced. And so it was that, that kind of conundrum that I think needs to be looked at.
And in terms of that conundrum, and now coming back to perhaps just give us a bit more detail about Attain, like how are you guys looking to address that?
So we're looking to address it in a number of ways, and actually to kind of go even further back. So I kind of started at chartered accountancy and said how structured that learning was, and it, instructor-led sessions, a little bit of learning on your own, exams, but very kind of like rigid. How we actually learn as humans from the start is actually through playing, right? Children learn by, at nursery school, and there are lots of games that have, fundamentally grounded in helping people learn either how to interact with each other or how not to interact with each other, or rules and so playing and making mistakes is fundamental to learning. Making mistake and trying again and learning from the mistake until you succeed is really important, we think in learning. So there's a social aspect to learning as well, right? So listening to what people have experienced, what failures other people have had, what successes of other people had. So that kind of social aspect, playing with people, listening to people, is really important. So what we're trying to do is to remind people that, learning is best when you're having fun, because you kind of learn accidentally. Learning is best when it's social. So you're learning with and from each other. And learning has to have a purpose as well. So there has to be a kind of like a point to it. So I think it's also important that people have an appreciation of why they're doing the learning, right? To really kind of like ground it. So those kind of principles, if you like, are at the core of our approach to learning.
Very interesting, Nick. Very interesting. And I think as we go through the rest of the main body of our conversation, we'll definitely be able to touch upon and come back to maybe some of those key strains of the work that you're doing. If possible now then, Nick, I would really like it perhaps if you could introduce to our listeners the article by, I think there were a few authors of this one, but it was a piece in the FT from June this year. Would you mind just providing a bit of a summary and then picking out whatever the most kind of interesting points were for you in the piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So the article really focuses on a discussion around the growing. It's titled "The Growing Case to Embed Climate Risk in Finance Teaching," and I guess what the article is trying to provoke is a discussion around to what degree should finance training really begin to focus on and drill down into the specifics, if you like, of climate risk, and a little bit of discussion around fiduciary duties and are existing finance frameworks and the teaching around it sufficient, or could more be done to improve it? And I think the article really is saying that there are differing opinions on this, and that the debate needs to kind of like continue. And indeed, the authors, who are a number of professors at different business schools, kind of welcome the debate, really.
It's interesting. I'm going to probably butcher this, but I suppose in essence, the article from my reading was suggesting that we're either looking at a requirement for evolution and development of those frameworks, or fundamental rethinking of how those frameworks are put together. Out of interest, from your personal take, and obviously very, very informed take, like, where do you see things going in terms of the incorporation of sustainability within finance education?
So I don't think it needs a fundamental rethink, is my personal take on this. But I do think that, the article talks about the possibility of, innovative teaching approaches on sustainability. And for me, that really comes back to rethinking about the delivery of learning, and creating a safe space, if you like, for people to have this discussion, and to have the discussion about sustainable finance and what it means for a particular person's institution, to have that discussion in a safe way, with each other. I think that the financial industry has many smart people in it, so it's not an issue of intelligence. I just think that the conversation needs to continue, but the conversation needs to involve as many parts of the institution as possible. People have different roles, they have different perspectives, they come from different backgrounds. This is a kind of a diversity, play on the S of ESG. But that diversity of ideas and thoughts needs to be plugged into learning, so that the answers can be kind of unlocked. So I don't think fundamental change is required. I just think the approach and engagement needs to change, so that more people feel confident to put their hand up and say, how about this? Or we haven't thought about that, and what if we consider that? And that's how I think it will evolve. And I think that's the best way for it to evolve.
And out of interest, Nick, when you think about some of the organizations that you're working with at Attain, like, is there something about the way that those organizations view their people and the education of their people that you can pick out kind of common characteristics of what an organization's culture, if you like, learning culture, needs to look like in order to facilitate that? Is that something that you've identified?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we've been fortunate enough to play the game. So Attain has a game that people learn about sustainable finance, and perhaps come on to that in a little bit more detail. But we've played the game with people now from all over the world. And so there are definitely cultural aspects that come into play. And I think one of the important parts, and I talked about creating a safe space for people to learn. It's interesting, I think, to see how people engage with a learning at the outset. So there's still a degree of kind of hesitancy and suspicion that, I'm being tested here. Particularly, actually, when we talk about coming together to play a game, and we call it a game deliberately, it's not a simulation. Simulation creates an element of kind of pressure, and people think, I need to pass this simulation or not fail it. And different parts of the world engage with the game in different ways and at different kind of like paces. Also, different age groups engage with learning differently. So again, I think the game approach certainly appeals to a younger generation, right? I think they kind of get the joke quite early. They are quite keen to embrace the try and fail kind of, or deliberately kind of take an approach to the game just because they know it's a game and because they kind of can. And that's a legitimate way to learn as well. We also, I guess also what's quite interesting is the way financial institutions, and I get this and I've been kind of like part of it, allocate budget to training or to learning. And it's still very siloed. So, managers of departments or managers of divisions have a learning budget for their team. And really what would be great is if people get to learn with people from different teams. And the rigidity of the budgeting process makes that difficult sometimes, which is also interesting. And some institutions manage to break through that or have central pots for some kind of like training, and others struggle with it, which I think is interesting as well.
And out of interest, Nick, for those organizations that you've worked with that have been able to break through those silos and bring people together, I know you alluded to it before, but what are the outcomes that they're likely to experience as a result of being able to have that more kind of cross-department, peer-to-peer learning environment?
So the outcomes are real kind of, oh, wow, I didn't appreciate that was those are the issues that you're facing, right? So a marketing person, just as an example, playing our game with a relationship manager and really appreciating the complexity and the difficult conversations that a relationship manager may be having with his kind of like clients, you see, okay, I get it now a little bit more, and vice versa, right? The relationship manager now understanding the pressure that a marketing person is on to try and put the best face of the organization forward to the kind of like the public. So if there's a finance person playing with a compliance person, with a relationship manager, with a marketing person, with a communications person, with an HR person, that kind of like dynamic is magic, right? When you kind of see the conversation fire back and forward between the participants and them beginning to join the dots on how the organization moves as a whole and how everybody has a role to kind of like play. And just a much better appreciation of the pressures that they're all kind of like under really kind of like comes out, which I think is fascinating. And is great, right? Because that helps move an organization, forward, because you need to kind of appreciate that you all need to be moving forward, together.
Nick, I think it's brilliant. I hadn't really ever reflected on that whole idea of how do you bring together people that work in silos within your organization in a way that that's softer and less kind of, it just provides a really natural prism through which to learn and to understand each other's perspectives and each other's experiences, and to do it through the medium or the vessel of a gaming experience. And going back to your point about that kindergarten Americanism, but nursery school, when you're there and you're with the other children, you're learning to engage socially and to understand different perspectives through the medium of a game. I think that's so compelling, and that's obviously been core and central to what you've done at Attain.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm fascinated to know a bit more about the game itself, and I'm sure our listeners are as well. Like, can you give us a bit of a flavour as to what's actually involved?
Sure. So another important part of learning, if you like, which we really focus on, is that it needs the learning vehicle needs to be relatable. So people need to. It's important to take them out of the real world and put them into a kind of a safe learning space, but it still needs to be relatable. So we bring 30 people together, split them up into 6 teams of 5, and each team is challenged with running a virtual bank on the virtual island of Avalon, as we call it. So immediately it's relatable because the participants, the learners, are working for a bank. We can equally customize the game so it can be a wealth management kind of environment or an asset management environment. So the participants immediately are transported to somewhere safe and out of the real world, but they can relate to it because they work for a bank. And then we keep it simple. So we introduce some basic concepts and definitions around sustainable finance, but we ask the participants to think very simplistically about two sides of a very simple balance sheet. So on one hand, we ask them to put capital to work to generate revenue for their bank, but also to think about the impact that that capital being put to work would have on the island of Avalon. So essentially, they build a loan portfolio, and we give them some information, not all information, crucially, about the loans that they could lend to companies on the island of Avalon. The reason I say we don't give them all the information is because we give them an indication of the E, S, or G impact that the loan might have on the island of Avalon, but not all three at the same time. And this is a little bit frustrating, but it's a game. And it's also arguably true to the real world at the moment, where ESG data is either not available or inaccurate or scarce. But it's only a game. So focus on the information that you do have, work as a team, decide which companies on the island of Avalon you want to lend money to, thinking about profitability, fundamentally important, impact that you can have on the island, the reputation that the loans that you make will have in the eyes of the Avalon public. Wrestle with those things, one side of the balance sheet. Then the other side of the balance sheet is to attract savers or investors into your institution. And we explain to the participants that not all savers think the same way. Fortunately, in the island of Avalon, there's really only two different types of savers. One set of savers cares most about financial return. The other set of savers is beginning to care about the ESG credentials of the bank that they may choose to put their hard-earned savings with. So then the participants need to design a very simple savings product, and they can use various levers, one of which is the interest rate on their saving product, which is obviously going to appeal to those that are motivated by financial return. They have to spend a little bit of money on marketing so that the residents of Avalon at least know they exist and know what they're about. And they have to decide what flavor of ESG credentials they're going to market themselves as having. So at this point, we've kind of introduced them to their shareholders as a stakeholder and the importance that they still work for a commercial organization. So they have to think about profit and return. They've met stakeholders, customers who want to borrow money. They've met stakeholders who are the island community who may choose to save with their bank. Then we bring them back from their teams when they've been making decisions and play back the decisions that they made to the kind of like the room. And we say, isn't it interesting? Only one of you chose to lend to this company, or none of you chose to lend to this company, or you all chose to lend to this company. And then we just encourage a discussion. So we say, Team B, talk us through why you chose the loans that you did. What was the discussion you had as a kind of like a team? Why didn't you choose this loan? Why did you choose that loan? And just allow the kind of like the conversation to kind of go, right? And we encourage all members and all teams to just talk about what they went through when they were making their decisions. And that's when the penny drop moments happen, right? Where you kind of see people go, oh, we missed that, or, oh, that's interesting. We hadn't kind of like thought about that. Or, okay, so this particular loan, it has an E impact. It potentially has an S impact that we hadn't considered. They had kind of like considered. That's kind of interesting. Let me kind of like think about that and reflect on that. So we provoke that kind of discussion. And then we say to them, while we were having this discussion, there's an unexpected event occurred on the island. You need to go back into your teams and deal with this event. And what this event, the design around the event, is to make the participants think about the wider community that they kind of like serve, and how their actions will impact the perception of the community on them as an institution, but also how their actions are, or their reputation is not entirely within their own control. They're part of an industry, and the community views the industry kind of like as a kind of like a whole. And so even if you respond to an event in a certain way, if the other market participants respond kind of differently, then you may be kind of tarred with the same brush, right? So thinking about, how do I deal with, how do we deal with that as a kind of an institution? And also, how might individuals respond to an event on an individual basis versus how they may respond from a corporate kind of like basis, right? Because how you respond to an event may tug at your heartstrings, but it isn't inconsequential. So, if you respond to an event in a certain way, it may be free and it may be, but it may have an impact. You may respond in a different way that might be expensive and have a different kind of like impact. So those things need to be kind of weighed up. Then we bring them back into the group, talk them through, ask them to talk through the decision-making process around how they responded to the event. And then we kind of play out, okay, so here's the outcomes of the choices that you made as teams on an individual team basis and as a kind of a collective. And the outcomes are what happened to your finances as a bank, what happened to your reputation as due to the choices that you made, and what happened to the island in terms of ES&G impact as a result of the choices that you as a bank made individually and you as a banking industry on the island made kind of like collectively, and provoke a discussion. And we show them how the loans played out and the consequences of savers' decisions so that they can kind of really drill down into it and see it and understand it. Then we ask them to, for the final task, to go back into their teams, to reflect on what they've learned, what they found difficult, and think about what they might do differently in the future, or if they had the opportunity to come and play the game again. So this is to ask them to kind of, as I say, to reflect and think about what they'd heard, what they looked at in terms of the outcomes and, what they've learned, and try and kind of put that down as a team into a kind of a forward-looking strategy. We bring them back into the group. We ask them to do a little bit of a show and tell and talk out loud about their strategies and share their ideas with each other. So again, there's penny drop moments where the other teams go, oh, that's great, we didn't think of that, or, we did think of that, aren't we good? However that might work. And then we wrap the game up by asking the teams to vote on the winning bank, if you like. Okay, so we show them little league tables where they can see the bank that made the most profit, the bank that had the best impact on the island, the bank that enhanced its reputation the most. We also at this point have introduced the regulator, who will have arrived and handed out some greenwashing fines, which will be where the banks have kind of marketed themselves as having a high ESG focus, perhaps, whereas in fact their loan portfolio turns out not to be quite as high as that. So the regulator, who's another stakeholder, suddenly arrives in the room, and 4 out of 6 teams may be given a greenwashing fine, which also then plays into reputation and financially, because there's a fine, which bank is the kind of like, the best bank. So then we ask the participants to vote, and they choose who's the best bank, because that in itself is a difficult kind of like conversation, right? Because it's, what is the role of financial services? Is it impact? Is it to make profits for their shareholders? Is it a bit of both? What are the trade-offs kind of like required? So we aren't trying to teach people how to do sustainable finance, because I don't think that's necessarily kind of teachable. I mean, I think, accounting for it and, recording, green bonds or, things like that is teachable. But what we're trying to get people is to think about and to reflect and learn about the complexity of sustainable finance, the fact that there are trade-offs, there are many stakeholders and interested kind of like parties. It's really difficult to please everybody all of the time. And it's a journey, right? And ultimately, I think what we're really after as well is to just make people aware of some of the fundamentals, some of the fundamental risks, but also to give them the confidence to go back into their organization and start having these crucial conversations with each other, cross-department, cross-function, with their clients, with regulators, with academics, to talk about how best, to do this going forward. And back to the article, it isn't easy, right? And there are different opinions, but I think everybody needs to kind of engage with the topic and feel confident to engage with the topic and appreciate that it's an interesting topic. And that's what we're trying to achieve with the game. And I think we do. The feedback is off the charts. People really enjoy it. They really engage with it. And we think they learn a lot.
Well, Nick, I have to say, having heard you describe it, I think it sounds absolutely fantastic myself. It was every sort of new element that you introduced or next stage just added that additional degree of a fairly immersive and engaging experience that I think is fantastic.
That's and just one. That's just round one. So we also have round two, which I won't go into, which takes the game onto another level and pushes people to make investment decisions, that gives them more information that they didn't necessarily have in round one, that kind of held them back a little bit. But again, the investment decisions aren't easy. There are more compromises, etc., etc. So yeah.
Fascinating, and this makes so much sense as you were describing it of everything that you were saying earlier in terms of how you create an effective learning environment through play, through feeling safe, through essentially enabling people that are perhaps working in different departments or different areas of an organization to actually start thinking about the bigger, broader picture within a kind of not a simple framework, but an easily accessible kind of context, if you like. I love it. You mentioned that sustainable finance was your area of focus at the moment. As you were describing what you were describing, it seemed to me that what you're doing is applicable to, I mean, you could take that structure of that game and you could simply swap out the nature of the organization and the sector that it was operating in and potentially apply that sort of game to any other sector. Is that something that you guys are looking to do moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right. I think what we believe is that it's the vehicle that's the kind of the magic sauce, if you like, right? So the vehicle creates a relatable, safe space to engage socially, to learn with and from each other. That can be applied to different sectors, but also to different topics, right? There's no reason, and I think areas like cybersecurity would benefit enormously from this kind of vehicle where people get the chance to discuss, what is social engineering and how might it kind of like impact me and how might it impact my organization, and hear from other people and kind of go, okay, yeah, I get it a little bit more now. Okay, I'm now going to do my mandatory cybersecurity training with a little bit more enthusiasm than I did before, because, I kind of get it. It's not about getting 8 out of 10 in the multiple choice exam. It's about safeguarding the bank, society, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely, we can go, hopefully, many ways, either, into different sectors with sustainable finance training or into different topics with the vehicle. It's the safe, game-based approach that allows people to have fun and learn with and from each other that's important.
Nick, it sounds absolutely fantastic. If I wasn't a fan of Attain before the podcast show, and I'm sure my listeners will join us in thinking this, it sounds fantastic. I mean, again, picking back through the article, it obviously talked about innovative approaches to learning and the use of case studies and of other kind of learning environments. I think what you guys are doing just seems to align perfectly with that. I think perhaps we might reach out to the authors and suggest that they take a closer look at what you guys are doing if they're not already aware.
Yeah, absolutely. They'd be more than welcome to come and have a play themselves.
Absolutely. Nick, we've had a few technical issues, I know, but we've absolutely blitzed through our time together this morning. It's been a fascinating insight, and thank you so much for being so open and sharing such interesting details with us about your work. We'll finish now with the magic wand question, though. So, Nick, if we were to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the corporate world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Well, I guess it's a good question. I guess I have to be slightly kind of self-serving. I would really encourage corporates to, and particularly financial services, because I know that area best, to really look at learning and learning budgets and think about making learning fun, but obviously not just fun, with purpose. But I also think to try and encourage social learning is one thing, but to try and encourage the cross-fertilization of ideas So try and break some of the learning kind of like silos, so that people can have the opportunity to learn about other people's roles in their organization in a psychologically safe space where they can ask questions without fear of being kind of like judged. So really look at learning in a slightly different way, because I think that e-learning has its place and is great. And I would argue that more e-learning would be consumed when people have played our game. But people need to be engaged in a different way to really unlock the power of what's already, these organizations have super bright people. It's just a case of getting them to talk to each other and engage with each other through learning, I think.
And Nick, I love that as a magic wand suggestion, and don't worry about it being quite obviously closely aligned with the work that you're doing. It's a very good magic wand suggestion. It does remind me, I know on a different kind of scale and different context, but we've had a number of conversations on the Responsible Edge with people talking about the urgent need for the collaboration and partnership through organizations, through different entities, through sort of a macro level. I think for exactly the same reasons that we need that to happen in order to stimulate the kind of innovation that's required for us to address some of these issues at the macro level, we equally need that kind of collaboration and partnership to be stimulated at the micro level, at the individual level within organizations themselves. So I see a commonality there, and I think that's where we're going to get the real juices flowing and the innovations sort of flying. So Nick, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us this morning. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have too, and I hope we might have you back on at some point.
Definitely. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me.